Thanks for coming, everybody, to this noon hour history in sound listening session. I'm Ken Davies. I'm the audio technician here at the Oral History Center. And I'm very excited to have with us Dr. Charles Hardy from Westchester University.
Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie. Charlie Hardy. Charlie is a producer of a number of award-winning audio art, radio, and video exhibits, including the oral history-based radio series I Remember When, Time's Gone But Not Forgotten, Going North, Tales from the Great Migration, and one of my personal favorites, I Can Almost See the Lights at Home, a field trip to Harlan County, Kentucky, which he co-authored with Alessandro Portelli and won the Oral History Association's biennial non-print media award in 1999. Today we hope to explore some examples of historians working in sound. I thought, just as a starting point, I wondered if we could perhaps maybe briefly talk about some of the early examples of historical sound collage and oral history, oral with an A. Two works that come to mind that push the envelope in terms of sound documentaries are Born to Live by Studs Terkel and The Solitude Trilogy by Glen Gould. And,
which is brilliant.
Yeah.
Amazing work.
And that's kind of where I wanted to start before we got into some of the listing examples, was maybe some of the work that you admire as a producer and places where people could start.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a history, actually, of the radio documentary using oral reminiscences that goes back to the 19-teens, and actually back to Edison, which is in the Handbook of Oral History. It also deals a bit with video, but what interested me, because I sort of have a dual background, both as a producer in public radio and as a historian. And I always sort of straddled that fence for the first 15 years of my career. And at the time it was really obscure, because who's interested in the intersection between oral history and sound production? But it's sort of become of growing interest in recent years, because more and more people have the ability to work in sound and are finding, in fact, discovering the joys of it. So I think Glen Gould was the first person to really sort of think about it from a musician's perspective. And being a classically trained musician and commissioned to do, I guess, 3 works for the CBC, he decided he reconceptualized the radio documentary from a classical musical model. So he's thinking in terms of fugue, of layering voices, rather than in coming at it from a print perspective or a written word perspective, in which everything is sequential and monaural. So once he came up with the idea of contrapuntal radio, where you can literally have different voices overlapping. And I think that when he got to his third piece, the one on Mennonites in Canada, where you are in the world but not of it, and when you listen to his what he called contrapuntal radio, where he does this layering of voices, and if you try and hold on to a single voice, you're going to get lost, because once he starts the layering in stereo, it simply it doesn't work. But if you let go, and the analogy I used is, you all know they've got these wonderful prints where if you look at them and you unfocus your eyes, you can see them in 3 dimensions. And if you try and keep focus on, you're never going to see the three-dimensional images before you. Well, he did that sonically or auditorially. And once you then eliminate your desire to hold on to what you're listening to, you can then become in the world but not of it. You can actually, it opens up this sort of oral intelligence that is lost in higher education, or is actually lost in Western educational systems that are visually based. So so that was the wonderful thing about Gould, and they're hard listening nowadays, I think, both because of the subject matter and because of the production techniques. So there are a whole series of radio documentary producers who came of age after the creation of National Public Radio, which had this mandate to open the airwaves to ordinary Americans, to people. And so there was a new generation of radio documentary producers who started really thinking in terms of how can we share people's lives, getting rid of the voice of doom narrator, And that is historically, with the traditional radio documentary, you have a white male voice that introduces and frames and explains, and it's a very top-down model. So when NPR came along, there was this whole movement, which actually also came out of the CBC and out of Pacifica Radio in the United States, which was a left-leaning community radio operation, where they wanted to have spoken word documentaries without narrators. And more, once the audio cassette recorder came along in the late 1960s and 70s and decent external microphones, well, now you could actually capture and mix with sounds. And you could do these layered, and this was, you could do the layered audio work that that was very difficult when we were still doing 3-machine mixdowns. Once you had 8-track, 4 and 8-track decks, you could lay your sound elements up exactly in position, and then you could do your mixes, and it just it became more of an art form. So so I'm trying to think of other early influences. A piece I love is Damai Roberts' May, a Daughter's Story. Damai Roberts was based on the West Coast, and she had a Chinese mother and an American father who was a GI. And her mother had been sold into slavery by her parents in China as a child before the Second World War. She witnessed absolute horrors, had attempted to commit suicide 3 times as a child, and Damai, as an adult, wanted to find out about her mother's life story. And because her mother's English was very broken, and she was a reticent narrator anyway, Damai had to find a way to sort of tell her mother's story. How do you work with the voice of a reluctant narrator who's not going to give you much and is hard to understand anyway? So she created what she called a docu-play. And what Damai did was take her background and understanding of the work in radio theater. And of course, there's wonderful radio theater going back to the 1930s in the United States and elsewhere. So, so she sort of used music and sound manipulations and just excerpts from her mother's voice, and then her own voice narration based off of her mother's words to repeat words. So you think back to medieval literature before the written word really comes in. You've got this incremental repetition through which the story is told. And so Damai and other radio documentary theater people were really thinking about ways to tell a story in sound that doesn't come out of a journalistic background, that comes out of sound communication. So one of my favorite actually had nothing to do with radio. There was Steve Lopez was a radio fiction producer, and he did a series of science fiction pieces that were absolutely brilliant uses of sound. And I'm trying to remember the name of his most famous one from the 1980s. They were little 5 to 10 minute pieces, incredibly highly produced, and the sound, because he really believed in stereo, and so much music now, it's kind of stereo, but it's not really, because they don't use the sound movement from left ear to right ear, from one channel to the other. And if you're not using that movement, what's the point of having stereo, except it's okay, kind of maybe a little bit immersive, but not really. And so Lopez really wanted to move the sound, to move you through the sound. And he did that more effectively than anybody else working in public radio in the 1970s and 80s at that point. Firesign theater was an influence. So Firesign theater also, and this is the wonderful thing about sound communication is how it can move you instantaneously, not just through time and space, but into times and places that never existed. So you've got this wonderful ability to be creative in sound that radio documentarians and scholars were not doing because they didn't understand it, because they come out of a journalistic or an academic background, which is really monaural and print-based. So there are all sorts of different influences. And so when I was actually writing up the history of all of this, I called to public radio producers and engineers all around the country and in Great Britain and in the UK as well, to just say, what's the best thing you ever heard? When you started your productions back in the 50s and the 60s, I found some of the old, there's still 2 producers left who had been working for CBS in the aftermath of the Second World War, when open-reel tape, audio tape, was first introduced to the United States and Britain and Canada. And people were first had that ability to do pre-produced audio works rather than live audio works, which was all of the stuff from the 40s through the Second World War. So I got all of these samples together and was trying to say, okay, what's the history of this, the lineage? Where do they split off, and who've been the most creative people? There's something called audio art, and the audio art goes back to the 1920s. Bertolt Brecht was working in audio art in Germany in the Weimar Republic, and there were some of the experimental composers from the 20s and 30s in Great Britain and Germany were doing some really creative work where they were using what was back then. They were using phonographic transcriptions and finding ways to layer those live. So there are a lot of different influences sort of pulling into this, and yeah, I don't know, now I'm lost. So for this one, I was working in public radio in the 1980s, and in producing for NPR or NPR stations, there was a formula, and the formula was you start with your narration. Then you might have a musical bridge, then you introduce your first actuality, the excerpt from the interview. But if you're going to use music, you keep your musical bridges low, because you don't want them competing with the spoken word. And then you never want 2 voices at once, because if you have 2 voices at once, then it's going to be confusing. And there's studies come out of the University of Wisconsin, actually in the 1990s as well, that were interesting, and that is people who are brought up with musical training. We hear differently than people who do not learn an instrument when they're young. So people with musical training, when they're in a party, they can hear 2 or 3 conversations simultaneously. People who do not have musical training when they're young, when they go into a party, if those multiple voices, what they experience is cacophony and confusion. They tend to focus on one voice and try and stay on one voice. So I come from a family of musicians, and if they'd given me the right instrument when I was a kid, instead of the flute, which I hated, I would have been a musician like everybody else in the family. But I had that background and training, so what I wanted to do was I got a National Endowment for the Arts grant to be able to play with oral history interviews and archival recordings, old sound recordings. And my objective was to hold people's interest for 5 minutes. That's it. And so I had a series of themes. One was I'd done a series of interviews in which people in their 80s and 90s were telling me about the first hand radios they built back in the teens and 20s. So I did a program around that. A program around inventions. 2 Russians who had grown up in shtetls and before they immigrated to the United States had never seen electric lights or electricity, and talking about just the wonders of the modern world. And then found old phonographic recordings related to the introduction of the telephone and the introduction of electricity in the wrecks, just to sort of put them in a sonic historical context. And I figured if I can hold somebody's interest for 5 minutes, I win. So it was called Mordecai Morton Celebrated Audio Ephemera, Programs for the Ages. So I developed a voice that I gotten out of the old, the East Coast elite announcer voice that was dominant in broadcasting before the Midwestern standard television voice that you hear today replaced it in the 1930s and 40s. And so I had fun with these pieces, and I think about 35 stations carried them through the NPR satellite. But because we were working in an analog realm and they were monaural, you could only do so much in terms of the mixes before the noise started to just overwhelm the signal. And that is an analog recording. There's always noise in every recording, and once you dub, you add to the noise. So the next piece I did was...
sorry, I went out of order.
Oh, this card of the ballpark. And I got another NEA grant, and I went and I mixed it with Jay Allison, who some of you may have heard of. He's one of the most famous NPR independent producers. His latest series is This Is What I Believe, that I think still airs once a week in the States. And so Jay and I sat in a studio, and we put 4 speakers in each corner of the room. And it was a Mordecai Morton piece, but this time I had an old novelty recording from the 1930s called This Car to the Ballpark, and it was a mock trolley car ride to the ballpark from downtown. So at each stop, people would get on. So this was going to be my motif that held together these little life segments. And so I had 4 different people in it. And one was my great aunt, who was a Boston socialite who married her husband from Princeton, whose life was a tragedy because he went to Princeton and he never could loosen up. And she was an opera singer, and she left him for a Russian emigre, actually. And then the second was an African-American sharecropper who in the 1880s had been accused of stealing 3 peaches. And he said, I could, and I didn't steal the peaches, but I could hear him. I could hear him on the chain gang. And so his father ended up paying $27 for 3 peaches back in the late 1880s. $27 was 2 years' worth of wages for his family as sharecroppers. And so when he was 103, and I went to interview him, he told me this story 4 times in a row and wouldn't answer any of my other questions. And so I always came interesting. Why is this the story that he's sharing with me? And what I concluded afterwards probably was saying, look, I'm honest, I didn't do anything bad in my life, leave me the hell alone. But it's this wonderful story, and of course, if you all know the Alan Lomax prison chain gang recordings from the 1930s, here are the men in the chain gang singing. And so now I've got this guy from the 1880s saying I could hear them singing on the chain gangs, and I've got the Lomax recordings of men singing on chain gangs. Then I had an African-American woman who migrated north to Philadelphia in the 1920s, had a bad husband, and she almost killed him. She said, I had the knife, I was going to stab him, but I went to church first, and Reverend Tindley, he made me get down on my knees, and I prayed, and I cried, and I prayed, and I cried, and when I got up, the Spirit had lifted me, and I wasn't going to kill my husband anymore. And there are these wonderful recordings of the Tindley gospel singers from Tindley's church, and of African-American ministers delivering sermons from the 1920s and 30s. So I have all the sound I need to historically, sonically contextualize her story. And then there were a couple of others. So I started, each step of the ballpark would take you to a different person's life. With the sound, right, so I had society band recordings for Aunt Virginia. I had the chain gang for Mr. Robinson. I had the African-American songs for Mrs. Smith. And then the last one was a guy talking about an old white working class fellow talking about fire engines and about how the old ex-fire engine horses, when they were pulling milk carts in Philadelphia, when they heard the fire alarm go off, guess what they did? They'd bolt and they'd go towards the fire because they still thought of themselves as fire horses carrying the milk wagons behind them. So each one of them had their own music, and then at the end I took them and I mixed them over each other because they're all living at the same point in time chronologically. So I had my aunt, I mixed the sounds of their separate worlds in time with their narrations. And what would happen too, at one point I'd have sounds of music bursting from 4 corners in the room coming at you. At another time a voice is moving behind you while there's another voice emerging over in the foreground. And when you open up the sound in quadrophonically, it's amazing because you and I hear 3-dimensionally, not just left and right, which is what stereo does, but in a binaural field. And binaural recording in the 80s was really just beginning to to be picked up by acoustic ecologists, but we did have 4-track and 8-track. And a number of zoos and museums were using 8-track sound installations when you went into the lion cage, for example, to create the sound of the Serengeti. And so if we can actually do this, why not? Because when you open it up sonically, people are going to keep listening. And once you flatten things down to a bad stereo, to monaural, it's just not the way we hear or listen. So that's what this card of the ballpark was. It was just an exercise where instead of keeping somebody's interest for 5 minutes, it was going to keep them for 18 minutes.
We have a sample.
Yeah, so
but it's not in quadraphonic. That's the problem.
This is, the quadraphonic didn't get much use.
Charlie, this is Virginia. I seem to be ill and I want you to come and get me, dearie. I just got to come and get me. They're keeping me here. They're supposed to be on a picnic, but I'm not myself. And I want you to come and get me. And I must see you, Charlie. I must see you. I've got to see you, dearie. I've got to see you. I'm all right, but I was sick last night. See, dear. See, please come.
If you'd like to make a call, please hang up and try again. If you need help, hang up and then dial your operator.
That's it, dear. He's out. Operator, did you get that? And I must get him in. But I've got to bring to Charlie. There's something the matter with me. Please, the number is 879.
If you'd like to make a call, please hang up and try again. If you need help, hang up and then dial your operator.
Ballpark. This car goes to the ballpark. Fares, please. 10 cents, lady. Transfer, sir. Where to? No, lady, this car goes to the ballpark. All the way to the ballpark. Blabber Street. Next stop, Blabber Street.
I wanted to make money for lemonade because I was very hard up. And so in the garden, I had Allison dressed. I lay her out on the floor in the music room and got her cut out. Cut out her clothes.
Father was very serious about my being a musician. He wanted all his children to be something.
And that was her costume. Then I did something with Ashley. Then I took them to the garden and I played music.
So there's the introduction to this card of the ballpark. From there, I think it moves into Mr. Robinson is the next segment. That message, the phone message, that was she was less than a week before she died, and so once I got that, I thought, wow, what a way to frame this and open it up. And so it goes from that phone message less than a week before she died to a family dinner table conversation about 10 years earlier, to an oral history interview I did with her about a decade before that, and then it was just her singing from the 1968, I think that was a 1968 recording of her. And so the other thing I tell people in doing sound workshops is that once you start working with sound, and the wonderful thing is we've got, of course, tens of thousands of commercially released recordings that are available for anybody who wants to play with them, because most of them, so many of them are public domain, and if they're on an obscure label, copyright is no longer an issue. And then you've got the ability to do live recordings. And what I found in doing oral history interviews, and I learned this from the folklorists, is just don't ask about life stories and the rest. Get the childhood stories. Who lived under your bed when you were a kid? What's the first, what poems did your aunts or your uncles or your grandparents used to sing to you when you were young? All of and coming from a family of musicians, we had all of these musical recordings going back to the 1930s. So if you think in terms of when you're doing your field recording interviews, to get all of the sound events and objects that are going to enable you to really move people in time and space and place, you're going to have a whole lot of fun. And you're going to be able to hold people's attention and move them places emotionally and psychologically that you can't with narration or the word. So that was just an experiment.
Would we be able to play a little Prodigal Son?
Prodigal Son, this was the concluding piece of the Mordecai Morton series. And this was after I did Going North, Tales of the Great Migration, which we did about, I forget, 80-something interviews with both African Americans who migrated from the American South to Philadelphia in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and then black Philadelphians who were there to greet them. And one of the 2 stories emerged, and one was the Prodigal Son, because a lot of young black men who migrated north identified, and they learned this in church as children, and basically you leave home and what happens? You get led astray by temptation. And so I had 2 interviews with James Plunkett, and when he went north, he got led astray by temptation. So his story, fleeing the segregation of the South, wasn't one of upward mobility and success. He said, I would have been better off if I'd stayed back home, because I wouldn't have whored and gambled and drunk. I'd have a nice family now. I'd have kids to take care of me. Instead, I'm living in the senior home. My niece is taking care of me, and I don't have anything. And James Weldon Johnson wrote a poem. This is a famous African-American composer. Wrote a poem called and poet wrote a poem called "The Prodigal Son" that he recorded in the 1920s. So I had these prodigal son stories because these African-American men understood their lives in biblical terms. And then I had a woman who came north, and before she came north, her minister and her parents told her, just remember Mary. And Mary was the female equivalent of the prodigal son. Mary went north. She got led astray by temptation. She gave her virtue to a young man, and she ended up dying of TB or something else in the north. So if you're going to go north, remember Mary, which means stay close to the church and don't walk on the grates next to the houses on the streets, because what's going to happen in Philadelphia, those grates will open up. You'll be dropped down into the basement, and they'll kill you, and they'll sell your body to the medical schools for medical experiments. And there's actually a history behind that. That's based in fact, grave robbers from the 1880s who were going to African-American cemeteries because they could buy bodies cheaper and with less chances of being caught. So I had these wonderful sound elements. And so this is a monaural piece, and it was the longest of the Mordecai Mortons. And you can see how then I mixed these together. So you see, there's the setup, right? All of these are period recordings, African-American. And it provides you then the context for these elderly men talking about their own life experiences. And once you set them back in those sonic contexts, to me it was just magical, the way it just came to life and opened up. So that's the beginning of the Prodigal Son.
Do you want to talk about this? Because I feel like we weren't able at the conference.
Oh, for Erin Anderson.
This incredible piece.
Oh yeah, Erin is a digital story. She teaches creative writing at the University of Pittsburgh, and we ran into each other I think 4 or 5 years ago. And what she was doing was taking oral history interviews, and because she is a creative writer, she was doing things that drive oral historians nuts. And this was one of the ones that really pissed off the oral historians, in that she had an interview with her grandfather, and then I forget who the woman was, but she took them and she created conversations that never existed, a relationship. She turned them into a husband-wife and a therapist, right? And now she's using these excerpts from oral history to create a relationship that never existed. In order to tell a story about marriage. And so it was a lot of work, a lot of edits. But it's kind of, what I like about it is when you're thinking about how to use conversations or oral history interviews in particular, there are all sorts of creative ways that we really haven't thought about yet. And there's no reason, as long as you've got you're not violating anybody's trust or you can really do some very creative things. So,
The thing I'm most impressed with is just editing this whole concept. She got it up to 43 minutes.
she's,
It's a back and forth, and it's got a story arc and all this
yeah.
stuff.
Erin's a bit compulsive.
It's a masterwork of editing because you can't tell the difference.
They have different sessions with the therapist, so she has the therapist also counseling them and interjecting between these imaginary conversations.
I don't have a question, but have more of a, I guess, a story. But hearing this and knowing this now and understanding, like I'm past history, oral history, and I grew up to listening to radio shows and just loved them. And also like a reader, I like to read, but the radio shows, because it just like it transported me right into the middle of that place. And I also sing in a choir, so I know what you're saying. And we get to learn, like you have to hear all the other 3 sections of the choir and the piano at the same time. And it, again, transports you like into the middle of that song. And so to hear you, and then I came into the oral history class and fell in love with, I can almost see the lights of home. And I thought, yes, because I was transported right into the community of these people. I loved it. The chickens were clucking in the background, the dogs are barking, somebody else was yakking about something, a door slammed, and the person that you were interviewing would turn around and say, oh yeah, well that's just so-and-so coming home from somewhere. So it directs them to it's the total part of their lives. And so I was always wondering why I was very uncomfortable doing my interview in such a sterile place. I mean, I did it because it was a university assignment, but I was never comfortable with it. I wasn't comfortable with that, and I was never comfortable with the transcribing, because the written word flattens the story. You don't get all the nuances and the sounds and that. And then not only that, but then we had to edit out the ums and the ers and this and that. And I really resisted, because for me, that erased the voice of that person. And so I fought against all those things. And when I did just my own interviews with other, like family histories wanted interviews, it was just amazing, because I just let it go, whatever was happening. And I interviewed one woman, a Mennonite, and in her kitchen she had a bird clock. And, and every now and again, all of a sudden this bird would start, in the clock, and we'd stop and we'd laugh, and she'd say, and she said, that reminded me of something. And so you get this other story. So I just wondered, like, why did we have to go so sterile in the...
There are a lot of good reasons for doing it. And in the old days of radio, one of the reasons why, if you were going to play somebody in a sound, you want to record those sounds separately. Because then when you're making edits, if you've got silence in the background, you can place them in any soundscape that you want to. While if you're recording them in a noisy environment, and let's say that, here it's in the middle of the bird call, and then you want to cut from there to where there is no bird call, you're going to have to then mask that with a sound bed or a bridge that it takes you from one section to the other. It was more problematic in the days of analog recording because of the noise. And now with digital recording, because it's so clean, and because of you can do production on your laptop for free, there's less programmatic need to do it. What I recommend with people is if you really have a good narrator, do at least 2 interviews, one in a silent environment, because one of the advantages is that there are no distractions, and it's just, you have the voice in all of its richness with no, what some people would call competing sounds. Do a second interview in the field, with factory worker on the site of the factory, if you're talking about a strike, the site of the strike, or and that way you can move back and forth between often ask some of the same questions. And then you get increased sonic interest, because you're moving them from one sound environment to the other and back and forth. And just their tonality, the rapidity of the speech, and the stories that they're going to tell are going to vary as well. The other thing I encourage people to think is think in terms of every media has its own strengths. I remember decades ago there was the Schomburg Library in New York, which is the African American library. It was one of the first major oral history projects to videotape their interviews. And back then it's $700 a day just to rent the video equipment. And so the way they explained it, what would you rather do? Read Thomas Jefferson talking about how he wrote the Declaration of Independence, listen to Thomas Jefferson talking about how he wrote the Declaration of Independence, or watch Thomas Jefferson talking about how he wrote the Declaration of Independence? And of course, so some people want to read, some people want to listen, but most people are going to watch. To which my response, okay, suppose Thomas Jefferson, while you're watching, has a big Luger coming out of his nose, right? Or has a mannerism or a tic. How much are you going to actually hear? Because so much of communication is nonverbal, and if that's interfering, then so rather than think in terms of either or propositions, think in terms of use each medium to its strengths. So when you're working in sound, one of the things we did in Lights of Home, we couldn't use narration because the narration just sounded like an interruption when you write stuff out. But then we had Sandro's accompanying article and my accompanying article when you're doing analysis, when you're doing historical context. Well, then the written word is the best way to do that. And so if you think in terms of, particularly once you move into the digital domain where you can use the written word and sound and moving images and still images, two-dimensional objects, and you work in a multiple medium environment in which you work with the strengths of each medium. And we're not writing anymore, we're authoring, or sculpting, or painting, or composing. And here's where every different verb that you choose, when you use a different verb, you're going to take the same materials and you're going to work with them differently, and you're going to come up with a different end product, just because of the different verb that you by which you orient yourself to the composition. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Well,
but
and I agree with you too. I mean, certainly every medium, has its importance, and I do support and agree, like, a sterile environment, interviewing at times with people, and that's the other thing too. Like, I mean, I just don't have the technical skills.
Yeah. And you think about when you're a kid, some of the best stories are when your parents are giving you the night, the bedtime stories, a silent, dark environment as you're about to fade off to sleep, or ghost stories around the campfire. I mean, sometimes that isolation in which all of your attention is focused on that sound source is what you want. Alex.
So I guess I have two questions. One is I'd like you to elaborate a bit more on the uniqueness of sound. Sally talked about, having interviews and then transcribing them and the different strengths and so on. What to you is unique about sound? What does sound give us that text or video cannot give us?
It's multidimensional. And that is and when you think about music, right, and a good musical composition, you've got two or three voices simultaneously that are playing simultaneously in your head. And print is absolutely monaural. And the tyranny of the eye, in the words of Walter Ong, in fact shapes cognition and misshapes cognition. And I think once we move back to an oral universe, it's more integrated in ways. And I mean, this goes back to McLuhan and Ong and all of the media theorists. When you look at the physics of sound, our sound develops in utero before sight and taste do. And if you look biologically, what was the first sense that enabled us to survive and protect ourselves, particularly in an environment where sight lines were limited and predators can come from many directions? So I think sound has different it operates physiologically on a different level. So one of the, I was talking with Kent last night about sound phobias and sound romances. The other thing is that we are hardwired that certain sounds provide us pleasure, and certain sounds are just universally bad. Sounds of fingernails on a blackboard is a universe, and that infants across cultures like thirds and don't like sixths in terms of totally, and so that we are hardwired physiologically to have certain sound romances and phobias. And once you understand how those sound romances and phobias work, you can. It enables you. I did this when I taught a sound communication class at the University of the Arts in the early 2000s. And the first exercise I would have the students do is go out and record 5 sound romances and 5 sound phobias. And then when they did their term papers, which were 5 to 15-minute audio pieces of their own, whatever they wanted to do at the end, they had to integrate some of those sound romances and phobias. And I think what sound communication is able to do is move you because it is multidimensional rather than it just opens the world that you can use the spoken word and recorded sounds to compose. And music moves us in a different way than writing does, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And so I think that it's not a replacement for the written word, but as a supplement to, or as another way of, that I think if more historians were to be working in sound, we'd be getting different insights about historical process, just because of the multidimensionality of it.
So I want to follow up, because you just said that if more historians worked in it. I can almost see the lights of home, and apart from all the different sounds and that together, what I really like about it is when you interview Portelli
Yes.
about the production, about
Yes.
his interviews. To me, this brings into this a completely new dimension that I didn't hear in any of the other samples that you had. And I'm wondering, you've been following the scene much more closely. Where has, that sort of, this art form gone in the last, 18, 19 years? Since
I
you recorded,
don't think it's gone anywhere. This is when Doug Boyd asked me to do it. I said, maybe this is a dead end. Maybe there isn't going. But I think when you listen to a lot of, in the United States now, there's a beautifully highly produced radio programs in which they moved from narration to interview. And I think when I first played Lights of Home for students in my classes at Westchester, what they provided me an insight that I'd sort of thought about but never really articulated, and that was, once, if Portelli had been narrating, or me or somebody else, we would have been the authorities telling the meaning of this. Once it's me asking questions to Portelli, they now become the person who's doing the interpretation and making sense of it all. That you really empower the listener and give the listener authority in a way that with a traditional, and when we write, we are the voice of authority, right? It's our words. So I like that, and I think that more radio programs have been moving to that interviews about interviews, just because it opens up the conversation. It's more engaging. But in terms of Lights of Home, there was the one woman, right? We've got.
Oh yeah, I can do. Yeah.
One of the reasons I was interested in coming up here, and one of the things that's sort of gratifying, is that 5-10 years ago, nobody knew what Lights of Home was. It had been lost and gone, and now I meet more and more people. Oh, I've heard that and I really enjoyed it. So maybe it's sort of the time is arriving.
The one that stands out in my memory is when he's in Chicago and he goes to visit a woman, and there's somebody else there, and he knifes the guy and he says, "There's nothing personal, but if I see you again, I'm going to kill you."
Yeah.
And that to me really drove home that sort of southern rural, what happens when the southern rural culture makes its way to the city. Mm-hmm. And it was just so matter of fact, but inevitable. There was no question about what was going to happen if they met again.
You know what that reminded me of? It reminded me of my grandmother, who came from the southern coast of Sicily. And in Sicily, they had this code of honor. And my grandmother, I mean, middle class, never talked about those things. You know, she'd been living in Rome for half a century. And there was a story in the paper about somebody killing someone in Sicily. And she says, well, of course, he dropped him of his honor, and honor is washed in blood. And here was my old, sweet grandmother talking about honor is washed in blood in the 50s in Terni, as a matter of fact. And because that's exactly the same thing. It's not personal.
And, well, I didn't really start school till I was 14 years old. That's when Dad was making whiskey, him and my cousin and his son-in-law. And I was on the lookout with the shotgun to shoot 3 warning shots if the revenuers was coming. So the revenuers, they come. And I go to my spot where they could hear me fire the shotgun 3 times. I was just a small kid. Let me see. And I shot my 3 warning shots, but they was all sitting there asleep. So Chad Harrod and Leslie Ball, that was revenuers, and some of the deputies, they walked up on them and they waked them up, told them you're under arrest. But in the meantime, I had run and I'd shot at the revenuers trying to kill the revenuers. I was just a kid, but I was using a shotgun. It was an old 1913 shotgun, J. Stevens, the name of it. I still have it. And I shot the hard hat off of the Leslie Ball's head. But they never did return fire at me. I guess they knowed I was just a kid. So they brained Dad. And
you got caught in a belt line?
Yeah, I got caught in what we call the headpiece of Conveyor Belt. Well, when I was in the hospital, they told me the next morning, they said the phone, they couldn't, where they put me in traction, they couldn't get me in the room. They had to remove part of the door to get me in the room, and they left me out by the nurse's station.
I've stayed in the hospital with
They
Chester,
told me it
but
took
now he was
3 of them
in
to hold me in bed. The phone rang the next morning.
And,
They took 3 of them to hold me in bed, keep me from
basically,
getting out and going to work.
they done pretty good
I was
considering.
trying to get out of bed and go to work.
They had 1 aide and 1 nurse for 20 surgical patients.
About 2 weeks later, I really started
So
remembering
basically what they did
things.
was,
A lot of times I couldn't talk back, but
just
now before
the nurse,
that, I remember
she was constantly busy giving
the
them
doctor
shots
and my wife standing at the foot of my bed.
and stuff like that, and
I
whoever was
remember
there
the
took care of
doctor
the
telling
patients.
her he was from Iran, and I remember him telling her that the doctors had done all they could do, and it would be just
What did you do when you were in the
matter of 2 or 3 days till it'd be all
I
over.
done everything for him. I bathed him, shaved him.
And I wanted to raise up and hit the
talked
doctor
to
and
him,
cuss
kept
him,
him
but
out
I
of
couldn't
shock,
raise up and I couldn't talk.
The whole 9 yards,
I
you
want to
could
tell
say.
him,
For,
well, I'll tell you the words that I want to tell him. I want to raise
to
up and
tell
tell
you
you,
the
son of
truth,
a
I
bitch,
think it
I'm
was
not ready to
about-
die yet, and I'm not going to die.
he got hurt
And
the
I guess
7th
if I
of
hadn't had
May,
that
and
attitude, I
17
probably
days
would've
later, Sherry
died.
broke her arm.
And I had 2 small kids.
So the doctor that took care of him
You know,
wasn't
they
there
just,
that night. I had to bring
well,
her
Granny,
over here
she
to a
stayed
doctor.
with me day and night.
And
And the kids could come in, sit on
it
my
was
bed or
about
whatever they wanted.
21 or 22 days that I wasn't
And I
never
had
in
a
bed.
picture of my 2 babies there.
I'd come home long enough to take a bath
And I
and
guess
change
really
clothes
them
and go
2
back.
kids is what
And then when Sherry
I
broke
really
her arm,
lived
I was
for to
over
get
here
out
with
of
her of a night. I'd go back and feed him of the morning and bath him and come back over here and take care of Sherry and then go back and feed him supper.
How does it feel to be unable
Because
to.
see, his traction, he couldn't get nothing.
Well, I still get up in time to go to work
And
every day.
they didn't have the
I would
staff
love
to
to be
help
out
them.
there
They didn't have the help
driving
to
one of
do
these
it.
coal trucks or
And down here, they
doing,
really,
you know,
if
in
you
the
have a
log
child
woods or
in there,
doing
they
something,
prefer
I'd love to be doing
a
it.
parent to stay with
But I
them.
may go work one day, and I might
But
be
thank God Sherry went
down in
down.
my back now for the next 2 weeks. So
But people are listening now. And I think the other big thing that's changing it is that it's so easy to do now. And when I was produced, I can also almost see the lights of home. I did it on Deck 2, which was one of the very first affordable, simple digital audio workstations. But for every 10 minutes, I had to have an external hard drive that cost $110 to store it, to take it off of my Mac, just because digital storage at that point was so expensive. And now, of course, you can score how many thousand hundred lights of home can you store on your laptop? So that's changed, and I think that one of the really interesting things, before we did the workshop at the Oral History Association meeting in Montreal, we sent out a pre-conference questionnaire, and we had 27 people who had pre-registered, and another 3 or 4 who arrived up for that day. But we said, what have you produced? What equipment do you use for field recording? What's your level of expertise? And what have you listened to that's had the most influence on you? And what was most amazing about that was that none of them, maybe 1 or 2, mentioned what I would consider a decent sound work. Most of them, the closest we got was This American Life, but the others were just, they haven't heard anything. And I think that's, at this point, another one of the barriers, is because of the dominance of the eye, because people watch television, and because even public radio in the United States now no longer does the creative pieces. It's all news and features, which are basically science features. They're going to be, politics and all the rest. So people just don't hear the stuff. I mean, if you're into music, you've got your subgenre of music, and you've got this whole vocabulary and this world of knowledge about your favorite types of music. But for this kind of stuff, they don't know what the capabilities are yet. And I think once people hear, and I think it'll always be a smaller community just because of the dominance. I think that my hope and belief is that musicians are going to start using oral histories, and that at the Oral History Association there's a cellist from Australia who's done this piece where she's done interviews with boat people who arrived in Australia, and once they get there, their lives are miserable. They can't go to school, they can't work, and so she has just these excerpts from interviews, and she does it where she's got a live cello piece that she performs, and you see their words come up on the screen, and it's a single image of a woman sort of in the ocean, sort of looking out, so you just see her from behind. And so she'll repeat the words and then light one up as she's playing. So you get that sort of the incremental repetition and building. And it's a beautiful piece, and it would work in a concert hall, and she plays it in concert halls. So I think as musicians begin to integrate more spoken word, that may be what turns it around more than anything else.
Well, we're over time, so I'd like to thank Dr. Charles Hardy for giving us talk.
Thanks for coming.